ACDC frontman Bon Scott's untimely death was ruled as death by misadventure, but those who'd seen him that night believed the real cause was much more sinister. Before we get to that though, let's dive into the life of Bon Scott. Bon Scott's long way to the top of rock and roll was full of missteps, misunderstandings, and a few misdemeanors. But no one could deny that Scott was certainly on a trajectory to superstardom. All he had to do was keep it together and let the money, fans, and stardom come to him. Scott had a curse, and it was not about to let his life be easy, or even very long. Bon Scott was born Ronald Belford Scott in Forfar, Scotland, on July 9, 1947. His mom's name was Isabel, and his dad was Charles Belford Scott. It sounded like a joyful family life, but then fate served them up a devastating tragedy. Bon Scott had an older brother, but he never even got the chance to meet him. Sandy passed right after Bon was born. Once the Scotts produced another son, perhaps to fill Sandy's shoes, they were ready for a big change. They packed up what they had and started an adventure on the other side of the world. The Scotts moved to Australia and Bon started school. He was still going by Ronald at the time, but his class already had a Ronald. To remedy this, Scott's classmates, making a joke out of Bonnie Scotland, named him Bon. The truth was, there wasn't much Bonnie about Scott. In fact, he was about to get into some real trouble. By the age of 15, Scott had dropped out of school and was working in various jobs. That's when things took a dark turn. His list of offenses include giving a fake name to officers, absconding a large tank of gasoline, and having unlawful carnal knowledge. This behavior did not amuse the judge, and Scott spent the next year in juvenile detention. When Scott got out, he came up with his next logical deduction. He belonged in the army. Bon Scott may have wanted to join the army, but the army did not want him. They labeled him socially maladjusted, so Scott turned to something he picked up back in detention: playing guitar. While working part-time jobs, Scott founded the Spectres, which morphed into the Valentines. Believe it or not, the future hard rocker was now in a bubblegum pop band. This would have continued, but an earth-shattering scandal broke them up. The Valentines were having disagreements about musical direction, but these problems were soon eclipsed when authorities caught them in possession of illicit substances. Half the band promised to quit grass, and others, including Scott, decided not to. In fact, Scott took this opportunity to speak publicly about the virtues of marijuana. This proved to not be the greatest idea. Bon Scott spoke to anyone he could find in the media about how backward the Australian government was. He thought they should legalize his drug of choice and went on to speak about gay rights as well. The truth was that Scott and his bandmates were playing with fire. You see, the officers could have caught them with something much, much worse. Bon Scott and his bandmates were doing much harder stuff. But herb was what the officers had caught them with. They all got off with a light fine, and the band tried to get their career going again. It wasn't meant to be. The Valentines broke up and Scott was a free man. The only problem was that Scott didn't like being free. Scott went in search of a new band, but found something even more. He moved to Adelaide and hooked up with a band called Fraternity, which was a better fit for Scott. He also hooked up with a woman, Irene Thornton, and the two quickly got serious. Scott was in a good place. He had a relationship and a new band that worked for him, but it was while working with Fraternity that he discovered his kryptonite. One member of Fraternity, Bruce Howe, remembers that there was one thing that made Bon Scott crazy. His curse was that he couldn't stand being bored. When the band was between gigs, Scott would start acting out. Howe remembers climbing on the back of Scott's motorcycle when Scott was in the middle of one of his restless periods. Howe said they went so fast and turned so sharply that his boots were scraping against the road. Howe survived, but vowed to never get on the back of Scott's bike again. He also warned Scott to stop riding his motorcycle while under the influence. Not heeding this advice would lead to a world of pain for Scott. Bon Scott was finding success in Fraternity, and they were getting quite popular. In fact, they won Australia's biggest music prize. This was the Hoadley's Battle of the Sounds, and it was great news for Fraternity. The prize was $2,000 and a trip to Los Angeles by boat. Scott did not seem as happy. He knew that a secret from his past would prevent him from using the prize. While the $2,000 was great, the trip to LA was not going to work out. You see, Bon Scott had been in too much trouble with the law, possession charges, and other misdemeanors, and the US government was not about to let him in. The band had to think fast. They took the $2,000 and frantically tried to find a country that would let Scott in. Fraternity decided on the UK, and Bon Scott decided he wanted to bring his girlfriend along for the ride. This was when Fraternity's manager disappointed him with a hard no. The rule was that they'd pay for wives to join the tour and not girlfriends. Scott came up with a risky solution. He proposed to Thornton, and she accepted, so they tied the knot. It may not have been the most romantic gesture, but a gesture it was. Soon, Fraternity and their entourage were heading for London and more misadventures. Fraternity had big plans for this tour, and they even brought their own tour bus all the way from Australia. They rented a house and their entire entourage, which now clocked in at 20 people, lived here together. The only thing was, it was hard to get gigs. In fact, it was costing them more to live there than they were bringing in. Right in the middle of this financial crisis, Scott decided to take a trip home to see his family. It was an epic disaster. Mom put her son on a plane back to the UK. The day he was due back in London, the tour manager went to the airport to pick him up. Weirdly, there was no Scott at the airport. They called his mother, who confirmed that she'd put him on the correct plane. For an entire week, no one knew where Scott was. That's when the tour manager got a shocking phone call. Bon Scott was calling from the airport, and his tour manager raced there to get him. He found Scott not even wearing a shirt, even though it was winter in London. That's when Scott told him an unbelievable tale. He said that he didn't even know where he'd been. He thought that maybe he'd followed a woman off the plane, and it may have been in Bangkok. Well, at least he was safely back in the UK, but things on the gig front had not improved one little bit. While in the UK, Scott had an interview and the reporter started asking him questions about iconic bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Scott's answer was unforgettable. Without missing a beat, he simply said that his band was better than them. In the same interview, Scott also said that they were rich. It was a strange thing to lie about. They certainly weren't rich, and it soon became clear that if they didn't make a change, they'd be in big trouble. Fraternity changed their name to Fang. A mid-tour name change is something of a red flag, and definitely not the sign of a successful tour. They realized it was time to go home. When the band got back to Australia, they went on a hiatus that turned into a permanent breakup. Scott also took the opportunity to break up with Thornton. Now he had no band to play with and no wife to live with. Boredom was creeping in and would inevitably lead to trouble. Instead of getting into trouble, Bon Scott faced reality. Well, the reality was that he needed to make some money, and to do this he had to sink pretty low. Scott took a job at a fertilizer plant and was quite literally up to his ankles in fecal matter all day long. Sure, his days were anything but pleasant, but Scott took advantage of the nights. He was getting ready for something big. While working at the fertilizer plant, Bon Scott connected with a group of musicians called the Mount Lofty Rangers. It was here that Scott started to explore writing his own songs. He also learned how to play the guitar properly. In short, Scott was preparing himself for something, and something amazing was certainly coming. But before Scott could go really big, he'd face yet another major tragedy. One night while rehearsing with the Mount Lofty Rangers, Scott, who'd been drinking heavily, got into an argument with one of the other musicians. Scott left the rehearsal place in a huff, got on his motorcycle, and rode away. It was a brutal mistake. What was waiting for Scott on the dark highway was a tragedy of the highest order. A man named Lee Morgan was driving with his friends when they had a major collision with Scott's motorcycle. Scott flew off the motorcycle and crashed through the windshield of Morgan's car. Morgan didn't have the chance to see Scott, but if he had, he would have recognized him from the poster of Fraternity he had on his wall back at home. If Scott was Morgan's hero before the crash, he certainly wasn't after. Bon Scott was badly injured in this crash, and his injuries had an impact on his performance ability. Because the crash was mostly Morgan's fault, Morgan received notice that Scott was suing him for $20,000. Luckily, Morgan had good insurance. So what exactly happened to Scott in that crash? It was actually very serious. He ended up in hospital and in a coma, which lasted 3 days. But this didn't mean his hospitalization ended. Nope, Scott was in there for the long haul. He stayed in the hospital for 18 days due to his lacerated neck, broken collarbone, and tooth loss. As it turned out, This hospital visit was the best thing that could have happened to Scott. Bon Scott had planned to leave Adelaide, and it was this motorcycle crash that kept him there longer than he'd intended. If he'd left Adelaide, he never would have gotten his next opportunity. You see, there was a new glam band in town, and they were looking for a new lead singer. The band was ACDC, and Scott just had to convince them that he was the man for the job. Suddenly, Bon Scott was on ACDC's radar, but they had a problem with him. They thought he might be too old. Scott turned around and commented that maybe ACDC was lacking experience and too young for him. It seemed that negotiations between Scott and ACDC were at a standstill, until someone suggested a very simple solution. To find out who was right, Bon Scott agreed to a jam session with ACDC. The session went on all night long, and by the end of it, no one was talking about who was too old or who was too young. What they were talking about was the new lead singer of ACDC, and it was Bon Scott. But that might not have been exactly how it happened. There's another story that explains how Scott came to be the lead singer of ACDC, and it's even more dramatic. Scott's wife says that Scott was at an ACDC concert, and the band was only doing instrumentals because they just fired their lead singer. In this story, Scott spontaneously jumped on stage and joined the band, not knowing they were looking for a lead singer. In yet another story, Scott was working as a chauffeur for ACDC, and then auditioned to be their lead singer. It doesn't really matter which story is true, because in the end, ACDC chose Scott. Now they had the difficult task of convincing their publishing company. The first gig Scott did with ACDC was in Sydney, and the band's publishing company wanted to see if Scott was a good fit for the band. FIFA Ricobono went to the concert and was not initially impressed. She saw a heavily tattooed man who was loud, loved swearing, and had one of his front teeth missing. But Ricobono knew ACDC's audience, and she gave her immediate approval. Scott was in, and he was ready to take on the world. Scott's first stop was to take on television. At this time, there was an Australian music show called Countdown. They brought Scott and the band on, and Scott had a chance to show off the new performance skills he'd learned in the UK. Scott was positively electric on stage, and the TV cameras picked up every gesture. ACDC appeared on Countdown 40 times, but there was one performance that would go down in the history books. Scott's bandmates liked to dress like schoolboys, but Scott was not about to let them hog all the attention. To stand out, Scott had to come up with an outfit that would outshine his bandmates. To the shock and delight of the live audience, Scott came out on stage dressed as a schoolgirl. Scott was getting famous for his onstage antics, but offstage, ACDC was having trouble doing what they really needed to do: sell albums. ACDC was now composed of Scott, brothers Angus and Malcolm Young, and drummer Tony Correnti. Together they released the album High Voltage in 1975, which was only a modest success. There was yet another personnel change, and it was time for a new album. If their album TNT didn't help with recognition in the US, the band would likely have to call it quits. ACDC wanted Americans to notice TNT, so they came up with a bizarre idea. They wanted to use bagpipes on one of the tracks. The guys knew that Scott had played in a pipe band back in school, so they asked him if he'd like to play the bagpipes on the track. It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. Scott loved the idea, but there was a problem. He didn't actually play the bagpipes. Bon Scott really wanted to play the bagpipes on the track, so he didn't actually tell the guys he didn't know how to play them. Behind the band's back, he got a set and taught himself how to play. Apparently he was a great teacher, as his bagpipe playing became a classic addition to the song. Scott had done his best to make TNT a breakout album. Now he just had to see if it would soar. Well, the worst thing happened. TNT did well in Australia, but it didn't really do much of anything in the very lucrative US market. So, Bon Scott and his band members decided to take the best tracks of their Australian albums and meld them together in a new LP. Certainly they could catch America's attention with this. Quite literally all their eggs in one basket. Failure here would mean failure for Scott and for ACDC. The release of High Voltage in the US turned out to be a huge success, and Scott and the Boys sold 3 million copies in the States. The critics weren't always kind. One called the album an all-time low, but that didn't matter so much. The truth was out there. America loved ACDC. Sadly, some folks back in Oz didn't feel as fondly about Scott and his lack of morals. The first problem in Australia came from the government. One politician brought up Scott and his bandmates in Parliament. His complaint was that Scott and ACDC were bad for the morals of Australia. Scott had tasted the freedom of the UK and the US, and it seemed like his home country was a bit square in comparison. What happened next didn't help Scott at all. Bon Scott was getting the recognition he never could have dreamed of, but it had a twisted side. Young women were so drawn to him that they were getting tattoos of the band. The problem was that these young women were too young to get a legal tattoo, so they were doing homemade ones in their own backyards. Health officials thought this was completely unsafe and blamed ACDC. There were haters out there, but they could not stop the momentum behind Scott and ACDC. Bon Scott was reaching a level of fame that he couldn't have seen coming, and it was ACDC's 1979 album, Highway to Hell, that really sealed the deal. It was a huge financial success, and it made it into the top 20 in the United States. Scott's dreams had all come true. Sadly, he didn't have long to enjoy it. On February the 18th, 1980, Bon Scott went to the London club Music Machine. Scott had a lot to drink, and he decided to sleep it off in his friend Alistair Kinnear's car. When Kinnear woke up the next morning, he located his car and made a disturbing discovery. Scott was still in it, and he was out cold. Kinnear called for an ambulance, but it was too late. By the time Scott reached the hospital, he was already gone. The media was about to explode with this very sad news, and one band member saw a huge problem. Suddenly, ACDC's Malcolm Young realized that Scott's family might hear about Scott's passing on the radio or TV. He raced to a phone to call them in Australia. When her phone rang, Scott's mom thought Scott was calling to wish her a happy birthday. Sadly, it was the worst thing a mother could hear. Scott's family and fans had to deal with this incredible loss. They also wanted to know what the heck had happened. And well, it's a mystery. The official word was that the cause of Scott's passing was due to drinking, what coroners might call death by misadventure. But it came out later that Kinnear, the man Scott was partying with on his last night alive, was an alleged dealer. This has led to some dark speculation. Some believe that it was something more than drink that took Scott's life. The coroner found nothing but booze in his system, but some seem sure it was something harder that did him in. Regardless of the cause, ACDC was suddenly without a lead singer. After losing Scott, ACDC was ready to call it quits. They couldn't imagine a life without their beloved frontman. Scott's own family, however, encouraged the guys to not quit, and they reluctantly found a replacement for Scott named Brian Johnson. Johnson had an unexpected supporter, Scott himself. Before his passing, Scott had seen Johnson's band and said something like, "That's a guy that knows what rock and roll is all about." When they hired Johnson, they were clear about one thing. They didn't want anyone to try and be Scott. Johnson took this idea to the absolute extreme. One of ACDC's songs had become Scott's signature tune. It's a Long Way to the Top loosely tells the story of Scott's rise to superstardom. Johnson didn't want to touch it, and the guys in the band agreed. They didn't play the song for 20 years out of respect for Scott's memory. While Scott certainly had his problems with authorities in his home country of Australia, when it came to honoring him, they did not hold back. Scott's gravesite is now an official cultural landmark, and there's a statue of him in Western Australia. Melbourne took the opportunity to name a small street ACDC Lane, omitting the slash for legal reasons. If statues and gravesites don't float your boat, there may still be a way to see something very close to Scott in the flesh. Bonfest is an annual music festival set up to honor the legacy of Scott. It happens in Currymuir, Scotland, and fans camp out and rock out to bands honoring Scott and ACDC. Bon Scott's life was a tumultuous journey marked by an unrelenting pursuit of rock and roll glory. From his troubled beginnings and meteoric rise with ACDC to his untimely demise, Scott's story is both a testament to his undeniable talent and a cautionary tale of living life on the edge. If you enjoyed learning about the fascinating life of Bon Scott, don't forget to like and subscribe for more awesome content.